Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What if the life you're living right now, the frustrations, the plateaus, the feeling that you're somehow falling short of what you're capable of, what if none of that is your fault? Not because you're a victim, not because the world is against you, but because nobody ever handed you the manual to the most powerful machine you'll ever own, your own mind. Right now, in this exact moment, there's an invisible system running in the background of your brain. It's making decisions before you even realize a decision needs to be made. It's filtering what you see, shaping what you believe is possible, and quietly, consistently determining whether you move forward or stay exactly where you are. Most people go their entire lives without ever knowing this system exists. They wonder why they keep repeating the same patterns, why they start strong and fall off, why success seems to come easily to some people and feel completely out of reach for others. Here's what the top performers in every field, every industry, every area of life already know. Your brain is not your master. It's your instrument. And right now, you either know how to play it or it's playing you. By the time you finish this, you'll know exactly how to reprogram your mind for unstoppable confidence, relentless focus, and the kind of consistent execution that turns big dreams into real results. You'll understand the specific techniques used by elite performers to rewire their mental patterns from the inside out. And you'll have a step-by-step system, backed by neuroscience, proven by results, that you can start using today. Not someday. Not when you feel ready. Today. Because here's the truth that changes everything. Your brain is being programmed right now, in this moment, based on what you're thinking, what you're consuming, and what you're doing. The only real question is, are you programming it on purpose or by accident? Let's find out. And, more importantly, let's change it. Chapter 1. The Invisible Software Running Your Life. Here's something that might shake you a little, and I say that with complete respect, because the truth often does that before it sets you free. You are not the one making most of your decisions. I know that's hard to hear. You feel like you're in control. You feel like you think things through, weigh your options, and choose your path. And consciously, you do. But beneath that conscious layer, beneath every decision you think you're making, there's an entire system operating at a speed and scale your conscious mind can't even come close to matching. Your subconscious mind processes roughly 11 million bits of information every single second. Your conscious mind? About 40. 40 versus 11 million. That gap is where your entire life is actually being decided. Think about the last time you tried to change something about yourself. Maybe you committed to waking up earlier. Maybe you decided you were going to eat better, move more, speak up more, worry less. You started with real intention. You felt genuinely motivated. And then, slowly, almost invisibly, you drifted back to exactly where you started. You probably told yourself it was a lack of discipline, or maybe that you just weren't that kind of person. But here's what was actually happening. Your subconscious programming was resisting the change, not out of laziness, not out of weakness, but because that's literally what it's designed to do. Your subconscious mind works like the operating system on your smartphone. Every app on your phone runs through that OS. Every function, every response, every output depends on the software underneath. And that software, your mental OS, was installed during your childhood, your adolescence, and your early adult years. It was built from your experiences, your environment, and the messages you received from the world around you. Every time someone told you that you were too much or not enough, every time you failed at something that mattered, every time you reached for something and got knocked back, your subconscious recorded it, filed it, built a behavioral response around it. And now, decades later, that same software is still running. When an opportunity appears in your life, your subconscious doesn't pause to ask what you actually want. It runs the program that was written years ago. If that program says you're not the kind of person who gets lucky breaks, you'll find a way to talk yourself out of pursuing it. If it says that success brings unwanted attention or pressure, you'll sabotage your own momentum just before you break through. If it says that you always come up short in the end, you'll unconsciously arrange your life to prove that story right, over and over again. The most unsettling part, it doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels like rational thinking. It feels like being realistic, being careful, being smart. But it isn't. It's a loop. And most people stay in that loop their entire lives because they never realize the loop exists. Here's what you need to hold on to. These programs are not permanent. They were installed, which means they can be updated. The same neuroplasticity that hardwired your current patterns can create entirely new ones. Your brain is not a fixed device. It's a living, dynamic system that changes based on input. The people who seem to operate at a different level than everyone else aren't operating with different hardware. They've simply learned, intentionally or intuitively, how to update the software. They've stopped fighting their own programming and started replacing it. And that's exactly what we're going to do together. When you reprogram your subconscious correctly, confidence stops being something you have to work yourself up to. It becomes your baseline. Taking action stops feeling like a battle. It becomes your natural first response. Persistence in the face of difficulty stops being a character trait you admire in others and starts being the thing you do automatically, without thinking twice about it. You are not defined by the programs you inherited. You are defined by the ones you choose to install from this point forward. Let's start choosing. Chapter 2. Why the Smartest People Stay Stuck the Longest. You know someone like this. Maybe you are someone like this. They're sharp. They're motivated. They have genuine talent and real clarity about what they want. When they talk about their goals, you believe them because they believe them. And yet, somehow, the results never quite match the intention. Projects stall out. Opportunities get passed over. The breakthrough is always just around the corner, but never quite arrives. This isn't a talent problem. It isn't a focus problem. It isn't even a discipline problem. It's something far more specific and far more solvable. It's called subconscious resistance, and it hits smart, self-aware people especially hard. Here's the mechanism. Your subconscious mind has one primary directive. Not happiness, not success, not fulfillment. Safety, specifically familiarity. Because to the part of your brain that's been running survival calculations for millions of years, familiar and safe are essentially the same word. That's not a flaw. That's an ancient design feature that kept your ancestors alive long enough for you to exist. But in the context of your modern life, where the danger is often just the discomfort of growth, that same mechanism becomes the thing quietly dismantling your progress. Every time you move toward meaningful change, your subconscious interprets it as a threat to your current equilibrium. It doesn't evaluate whether the change is good for you. It only measures whether it's familiar. And when the answer is no, it responds with resistance. That resistance doesn't usually show up as obvious fear. It's far more sophisticated than that. It shows up as procrastination disguised as preparation. I'll start once I've done a little more research. It shows up as perfectionism disguised as high standards. I just want to get this right before I put it out there. It shows up as busyness disguised as productivity, packing your schedule with things that feel urgent, but somehow never move you toward the thing that actually matters. And here's the cruelest part. The resistance gets strongest right before a real breakthrough. Your subconscious can sense when genuine change is imminent. When the gap between your current identity and your next level narrows, the alarm bells get louder. This is why people often experience their most intense self-doubt, their most compelling excuses, and their most elaborate distractions precisely when they're closest to breaking through. It's not bad timing. It's not a sign you're on the wrong path. It's your subconscious making one last desperate attempt to keep you where it knows you're safe. Smart people are particularly susceptible to this because they're exceptionally good at constructing logical-sounding reasons for why right now isn't quite the right time. They can build a completely rational-sounding case for waiting, pausing, or pivoting, when what's actually happening is that their nervous system is pulling the emergency brake. Recognizing this pattern doesn't make the resistance disappear, but it fundamentally changes your relationship with it. When you understand that resistance is actually a signal, a marker indicating you're approaching something meaningful, it loses its power to fool you. You stop interpreting it as evidence that you should slow down and start recognizing it as confirmation that you should lean in. The people who become genuinely unstoppable aren't people who feel less resistance than everyone else. They're people who've learned to expect it, name it, and move through it anyway. They've rewired their brains to understand a simple truth. Discomfort is not danger. Unfamiliarity is not failure. And the life that's waiting for you on the other side of your current programming is worth every uncomfortable moment it takes to get there. Chapter 3. How your brain builds the cage. You live in your brain is extraordinary. It's also, in a very specific way, working against you. And understanding exactly how it does, this is one of the most important things you'll ever learn. Here's the foundational principle. Your brain isn't optimized for happiness or success. It's optimized for survival. And in that relentless pursuit of keeping you alive, it has developed mechanisms that, without your intentional intervention, quietly construct the very limitations holding you back. Every experience you've ever had has left a physical mark on your brain, not metaphorically, literally. When you were criticized, specific neural pathways were strengthened. When you experienced rejection, certain connections were reinforced. When you failed at something that mattered to you, your brain wired those moments into its architecture as patterns to avoid in the future. Over time, these pathways become like major highways in your neural network. The more they're traveled, the wider and faster they become. And eventually, they don't require any conscious thought to activate. A situation arises, and before you've had a single conscious thought about it, your nervous system has already run the old pattern. This is why limiting beliefs feel so real. They're not just thoughts floating through your mind, they're physical structures built through years of repetition that feel as solid and immovable as anything you could touch. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Your brain cannot reliably distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. When you replay a past failure in your mind, when you catastrophize about a future worst-case scenario, when you rehearse all the ways something might go wrong, your brain is strengthening the same neural pathways as if those experiences were happening in real time. You are quite literally building the architecture of limitation every time your mind wanders to what could go wrong. Now add to this a system called the reticular activating system, your brain's built-in filter. Right now, an enormous amount of information is available to your senses. Your brain can only process a fraction of it consciously. Your RAS determines what makes it through that filter, and it makes that decision based on one simple criterion: what has been programmed as important. If your RAS has been conditioned to look for evidence of your inadequacy, it will find it everywhere. In a pause before someone answers you, in a project that didn't land perfectly, in a comparison between where you are and where you think you should be. Meanwhile, it will filter out the daily evidence of your capability, your progress, and your potential. This isn't pessimism. This isn't self-pity. This is just your brain doing exactly what it's been conditioned to do. Two people can walk into the same room, experience the same conversation, face the same set of circumstances, and come away with completely different interpretations of what just happened. Neither is making up their experience. They're both seeing exactly what their RAS has been programmed to show them. Here's the turning point. You're already programming your RAS every single day. Through the thoughts you entertain, the content you consume, the stories you repeat about yourself, and the environments you place yourself in, you are constantly feeding this filter, calibrating it toward either possibility or limitation. The question is never whether your brain is being programmed. It is always being programmed. The only question is whether you're programming it consciously or by default. Default programming comes from your past, your environment, and the cultural narratives surrounding you. Most of those narratives are built on scarcity, comparison, and fear. When you don't actively intervene, you inherit those frequencies as your own truth. Intentional programming requires something different. It requires you to take ownership of what you're feeding your mind and to start building neural pathways that lead toward who you actually want to become, not who your history has conditioned you to be. Your brain is changing right now, in this moment, based on every thought you're thinking and every choice you're making. The only real question is, which direction is it changing? Chapter 4. The Real Architecture of Confidence. Let's clear something up right now, because this misunderstanding is costing you more than you realize. Confidence is not a personality trait. It is not a gift some people are born with and others aren't. It's not determined by how you were raised, what you've been through, or where you're starting from. Confidence is a skill, and like every skill, it follows a completely learnable, completely repeatable development process. The reason most people struggle to build genuine confidence is that they have the sequence backwards. They believe confidence comes from success. So they wait. They wait to feel ready. They wait to feel certain. They wait for some combination of experience and outcome that will finally unlock the confidence they need to move forward. But that moment never quite arrives, because confidence built on outcomes is always conditional, always fragile, always one setback away from collapsing. Real confidence runs in the opposite direction entirely. Confidence is not the reward for taking action. Confidence is the result of taking action. It's built through the accumulation of evidence, evidence that you are more capable than your fears would have you believe. And that evidence can only be collected through experience, which means you have to move first, feel it second. Here's the other thing about confidence that most people get wrong. It doesn't mean feeling certain. Genuinely confident people don't experience the world without fear or doubt. They feel those things, often intensely. The difference is that they've trained themselves to act through those feelings rather than wait for them to pass. Confidence isn't the absence of doubt. It's the decision that doubt doesn't get to vote. So how do you actually build it? Through a process called progressive exposure. You start at the edge of your current comfort zone, not miles beyond it, not safely inside it, but right at the boundary. You do something that stretches you slightly, something that makes your heart rate climb a little, something that requires a bit more of you than feels completely comfortable. And then you survive it, and then you do it again. Each experience becomes a data point, a piece of evidence deposited into your internal account. I did that. I was nervous, and I did it anyway, and I'm fine. That evidence compounds. Over weeks and months, it rewires your subconscious understanding of who you are and what you're capable of handling. This is also why dramatic confidence challenges often backfire. When people throw themselves into situations so far beyond their current capacity that failure is almost guaranteed, they don't build confidence. They build evidence for the story they were already telling about themselves. Sustainable confidence development is gradual and deliberate, not dramatic. Your identity is the foundation everything else is built on. If you fundamentally see yourself as someone who is naturally anxious, naturally hesitant, naturally prone to overthinking, your brain will work tirelessly to keep your behavior consistent with that self-concept. Not because it wants to limit you, because it's trying to maintain coherence between who you believe you are and how you behave. But here's what that means. When you shift the identity, the behavior shifts with it. There's a technique called acting as if, and despite how simple it sounds, it's grounded in hard neuroscience. You begin to act as if you already embody the confidence you're developing. You carry yourself the way a confident person carries themselves. You speak with the directness a confident person uses. You make decisions with the same level of decisiveness. At first, it feels uncomfortable, maybe even dishonest. But your brain doesn't file actions under genuine or performed. It files them under done. And every time you act confidently, regardless of what you're feeling internally, you are literally reinforcing the neural pathways of confidence. You are, in the most literal neurological sense, becoming that person. One more piece. Confidence requires resilience, not toughness in the sense of not being affected by things, but resilience in the sense of recovering quickly. Setbacks, criticism, rejection, failure, these don't stop coming when you become more confident, What changes is your relationship with them. Instead of treating them as verdicts on your worth, you learn to treat them as data. Instead of letting them reshape your identity, you extract the lesson and keep moving. Build progressive exposure. Shift your identity. Act before you feel ready. Recover faster than before. That's the architecture of real, lasting, unshakable confidence. Chapter 5. The Identity Shift. Becoming someone new. From the inside out. Here's a question that might reframe everything you've been trying to do. Have you been trying to change your behavior? Or have you been trying to become a different person? Because those are not the same thing. And the distinction is everything. Think about every meaningful attempt at self-improvement you've ever made. You set a goal. You got motivated. You changed what you were doing for a while, and then, slowly or suddenly, you snapped back. Not because you failed at discipline, not because you lacked desire, but because you were trying to run new behavior through an old identity. Your identity acts like a thermostat. When your behavior drifts too far from what your self-concept considers normal, it automatically pulls you back to baseline. It doesn't care whether your baseline is where you want to be. It cares about consistency, about alignment between who you believe you are and how you act in the world. This is why the person who sees themselves as someone who isn't really a morning person can set alarm after alarm and still find themselves hitting snooze. The behavior keeps conflicting with the identity, and identity always wins in the long run. So what's the answer? Change the identity first. Let the behavior follow naturally. When you genuinely begin to see yourself as a different person, not as someone trying to be different, but as someone who is different, the behaviors associated with that identity don't require discipline. They become expressions of who you are. But, and this is crucial, you can't simply decide to have a new identity and expect it to stick. Your subconscious doesn't operate on declarations. It operates on evidence. And that evidence has to be earned through action. Here's how the process works in practice. You start by getting deeply clear on the type of person you want to become, not the outcomes you want to achieve, not, I want to lose 30 pounds, but I want to become someone who genuinely respects and cares for their body, not, I want to make more money, but I want to become someone who consistently creates real value and is compensated accordingly. Not, I want more confidence, but I want to become someone who acts on what matters regardless of how they feel. That shift from outcome to identity is where the leverage lives. Then you begin taking tiny actions that the person with that identity would take. And I mean tiny, uncomfortably small. If you want to become a reader, you read 1 page tonight. If you want to become someone who exercises regularly, you put on your workout clothes tomorrow morning. That's it, just the clothes. If you want to become someone who shows up boldly, you speak up once in the next meeting you attend. These actions feel almost embarrassingly small, but they're doing something your subconscious can't resist. They're creating evidence. Every micro-action that aligns with your new identity is a vote cast for that person. And votes accumulate. As the evidence builds, something shifts. Your self-talk changes. You stop saying, I'm trying to be more consistent, and start saying, I'm someone who does what they say they're going to do. That's not a small shift. That's a complete reorientation of how your brain relates to those behaviors. Something else happens too, and it's equally important. You have to release the old identities that have been providing you with cover. Most of us are walking around with identity labels that feel like explanations, but function as excuses. I'm just not a detail-oriented person. I've never been good with money. I'm not the type who goes to the gym. These stories feel honest. They feel like self-awareness, but they're actually just old programs that have gotten comfortable enough to call themselves personality. Releasing them isn't about pretending they never existed. It's about deciding they no longer define what's possible for you. Here's the thing about identity that the most successful people understand intuitively. Your external results are always a lagging indicator of your internal identity. Lottery winners who return to financial struggle within a few years aren't failing at money management. Their internal identity as someone without wealth reasserts itself until their circumstances match. But the person who builds financial stability slowly through intentional growth, it's durable because it's an expression of who they've become, not just what they've accumulated. The same principle applies to every area of your life. Sustainable transformation doesn't happen when you change what you do. It happens when you change who you are. And who you are is always ultimately a choice, expressed through the cumulative weight of the daily actions you take when no one is watching. Start casting better votes. Build the evidence. Let the identity shift, and watch how naturally everything else follows. Chapter 6. The 5-second window. Where your future gets decided, there's a moment you know intimately, even if you've never given it a name. It's the moment you feel the impulse to do something. Speak up, reach out, start, try, push forward. And then, almost before the impulse has fully formed, something else moves in. A quiet but firm voice. A sudden awareness of all the reasons why right now might not be the best time. A gentle but effective gravitational pullback toward whatever you were already doing. That window between the impulse and the response, it lasts about 5 seconds. And in those 5 seconds, your entire future is being negotiated. This isn't poetic language. This is neurological reality. In the space between stimulus and response, your subconscious programming runs a rapid-fire assessment. It cross-references the impulse against everything it has been conditioned to associate with that type of action. The outcomes, the risks, the past experiences, the stories, and it generates a recommendation. More often than not, that recommendation is wait. Not because waiting is wise, because waiting is familiar. And by the time your conscious mind catches up to what just happened, the moment has passed. The meeting moved on without your contribution. The conversation ended before you introduced yourself. The important project sits untouched for another day because something less demanding pulled your attention first. This is not a discipline problem. It's not a motivation problem. It's a timing problem. Your hesitation isn't considered, it's automatic, which means you can't think your way out of it. You can only move your way out of it. Here's the mechanism, and it matters that you understand it clearly. When you feel resistance to taking a bold or unfamiliar action, your brain is activating the same neural circuitry it would use if you were facing a genuine physical threat. Stress hormones flood your system. Your heart rate climbs. Your mind accelerates toward generating reasons to avoid the situation. This response evolved to protect you from real danger. But your nervous system can't tell the difference between a predator and the discomfort of speaking up in a room full of people. It treats both as threats and it responds accordingly. But here's what changes everything. If you physically move your body within 5 seconds of feeling that impulse, you interrupt the pattern before the stress response fully activates. You count backwards. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you move. The countdown is not a ritual. It serves a specific neurological function. Counting backwards from 5 engages your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational decision-making, which creates just enough of a circuit break to override the emotional resistance being generated by your limbic system. You're essentially switching the signal from threat detected, stand down, to action initiated, moving forward. Every time you successfully use this technique, something important happens beneath the surface. You're creating new neural pathways that associate bold action with safety rather than danger. You're building what neuroscientists would describe as action-oriented patterns, automatic responses that lean toward engagement rather than avoidance. And over time, with consistent application, those pathways become dominant. The goal isn't to eliminate hesitation entirely. The goal is to close the window between impulse and action until moving becomes your default, until courage precedes comfort so consistently that it starts to feel like your natural way of operating. Start small, deliberately small. Use this technique to make one comment in a meeting, to send one message you've been sitting on, to spend 5 minutes on the project you've been avoiding, to introduce yourself to one person in a situation where you'd normally stay in your corner. These aren't small victories. These are neural investments. Every single one makes the next one slightly easier. Every 5-second win recalibrates what your nervous system considers normal. Most people spend years waiting for the perfect internal state before they take meaningful action. They're waiting to feel ready, to feel confident, to feel certain. But that sequence is inverted. You don't feel your way into action. You act your way into feeling. The 5-second window is yours. Every time you use it, you vote for the person you're becoming. Every time you let it close without moving, you reinforce the patterns of the person you've been. 5 seconds. Every time. Starting now. Chapter 7. Reprogramming your subconscious. Installing the new operating system. You've been running outdated software long enough. Here's what I mean by that. The core programming in your subconscious mind. The beliefs about who you are, what you deserve, what's realistic for someone like you, most of that was installed when you were somewhere between 5 and 15 years old, before you had the critical thinking capacity to evaluate whether any of it was actually true, before you had enough life experience to question whether the patterns being modeled around you were worth inheriting. And unlike every device you own, your subconscious doesn't update itself automatically. It doesn't push through patches overnight or prompt you to install improvements. It runs exactly what it was loaded with until you deliberately intervene. The challenge is that most people try to update their mental programming using the wrong tools. They use logic. They use positive thinking. They use willpower and sheer force of decision. I've decided I'm going to be more confident. I've decided to stop self-sabotaging. I've decided to think positively from now on. And none of it sticks. Not because they lack sincerity, but because your subconscious doesn't speak the language of conscious intention. It speaks the language of repetition, emotion, and vivid imagery. That's its native input. And if you want to install new programming, You have to communicate in those terms. The most powerful tool for doing this is called mental rehearsal, and it is dramatically different from wishful daydreaming. When you engage in genuine mental rehearsal, you're not casually imagining a positive outcome. You're running a full, detailed, emotionally engaged simulation of yourself operating as the person you're becoming. You see yourself walking into a specific situation, not a vague, blurry version of it, but a specific room, a specific context, a specific moment. You feel the environment around you. You notice how you're carrying yourself. You hear your own voice. You experience the emotions associated with performing exactly the way you intend to perform. The reason this works comes down to a fundamental feature of your neurology. Your brain processes vivid mental imagery using many of the same neural circuits activated during actual experience. When you rehearse something with enough specificity and emotional engagement, your nervous system begins to treat it as a real memory, a reference point that your subconscious can draw on when the actual situation arrives. This is not a motivational concept. This is why elite athletes spend as many hours in mental rehearsal as they do in physical practice. They're not just imagining success. They're training the neural pathways that will execute the performance when it counts. Pair mental rehearsal with what's called embodied practice. Physically rehearsing the behaviors you want to make automatic. Want to become more decisive? Start making faster decisions about small things. What to order, which route to take, when to respond. Your subconscious learns through pattern recognition. Every time you practice decisive action in low-stakes situations, you're building the neural pathway that will activate decisive behavior when the stakes are high. Want to become more confident in how you present yourself? Practice the physicality of confidence when it's just you. The posture, the breath, the pace of your movement. Your body sends signals to your brain, and your brain responds to those signals whether or not anyone is watching. Want to become more consistent? Start honoring micro-commitments to yourself, not the big ones, the small ones, the "I said I'd do this for 10 minutes" ones, because your subconscious is tracking whether you are the kind of person who follows through, and it's gathering that data from the tiny moments, not just the major ones. Consistency matters more than intensity here. 10 minutes of deliberate mental and behavioral practice every day will create more durable reprogramming than an occasional 2-hour session driven by peak motivation. Your subconscious needs steady, repeated input to accept a new pattern as legitimate. Sporadic effort creates noise. Daily effort creates rewiring. There's also an optimal window for this work, and most people miss it entirely. Right before you fall asleep and right after you wake up, your brain is operating in what's known as the theta brainwave state. During theta, your conscious filtering mechanisms are significantly reduced, which means your subconscious is far more receptive to new input. These two windows, the last few minutes before sleep and the first few minutes after waking, are the highest leverage moments for installing new mental programming. Use them deliberately, not for scrolling, not for rushing into the day, for visualization, for identity reinforcement, for rehearsing who you're becoming. You are already using those windows to program your subconscious. The only question is whether you're doing it intentionally or by accident. The new software is available. The installation process is clear. All that's required is the consistency to see it through. Chapter 8. making fear work for you instead of against you. Here's a reframe that has the potential to change your entire relationship with one of the most powerful forces in your life. Fear is not your enemy. It never was. Fear is a navigation signal, a built-in alert system telling you that you're approaching something that matters, something significant enough that your nervous system felt compelled to flag it. The problem isn't that you feel fear. The problem is what you've been taught to do with it. Most people have been conditioned through experience, through culture, through watching how the people around them responded to uncertainty, to treat fear as a stop sign, to interpret the presence of anxiety as evidence that they should slow down, pull back, wait for conditions that feel safer. But the most consistent performers in every domain on the planet, athletes, entrepreneurs, artists, leaders, people who have built things worth building and lived lives worth living, they don't experience less fear than you. They've simply developed a fundamentally different relationship with it. They've learned to treat fear as a green light, not recklessly, not by ignoring genuine danger, but by understanding that the specific flavor of fear that shows up when you're about to grow, when you're about to speak up, show up, try something new, put something real on the line, that fear is almost always a compass pointing directly toward your next level. The bigger the potential growth, the stronger the fear, which means the things you're most afraid of doing are frequently the things most worth doing. Your nervous system, when faced with an unfamiliar high-stakes situation, runs the same physiological response whether the threat is real or imagined. Heart rate increases, breathing shifts, adrenaline moves, your senses sharpen, your mind accelerates. That response isn't the problem. That response is energy, enormous, available, completely untapped energy that most people interpret as a warning to stop and use as justification for staying small. Here's what changes when you shift that interpretation. The exact same physiological state that you currently experience as anxiety can be experienced as intensity, as aliveness, as readiness. Researchers call this anxiety reappraisal, the simple but powerful act of telling yourself in the moment of fear, I'm not anxious, I'm ready. It works because the neurological difference between anxiety and excitement is almost non-existent. Both states produce identical physical responses. The only distinction is the story you attach to those sensations. Change the story, and you change the state, without losing any of the energy. But reappraisal is the entry point, not the destination. Building genuine fear immunity requires progressive desensitization. You deliberately, systematically expand your exposure to the things that make you uncomfortable, starting at manageable levels and gradually increasing the intensity over time, not because discomfort is inherently valuable, but because every time you encounter something fear-inducing and move through it anyway, you're creating a new data point in your nervous system's threat assessment. You're proving through direct experience that you can handle more than your previous programming suggested. Each experience builds what psychologists call a mastery memory, a stored reference of successfully navigating a challenging situation that your brain can draw on when facing future challenges. The more mastery memories you accumulate, the less your nervous system needs to escalate its threat response, because it has a growing archive of evidence that you handle hard things well. Start where you actually are, not where you think you should be, where you actually are. If speaking in front of a group terrifies you, you don't start by presenting to a conference. You share an idea in a small meeting. If approaching new people feels impossible, you don't start at a networking event. You make eye contact and smile at a stranger. If putting your work out into the world fills you with dread, you don't launch publicly on day one. You share with one trusted person. The courage muscle gets built exactly like every other muscle, through progressive loading, adequate recovery, and consistent challenge over time. One last thing about fear that I want you to sit with. The life you actually want to live is almost certainly on the other side of something that currently makes you afraid. Not because the universe is cruel, but because growth, by definition, requires moving beyond what's already familiar. Your comfort zone isn't where your life is. It's where your life is waiting for you to leave it. Fear is the door. Courage is the decision to walk through it anyway. Chapter 9. Building a mind that doesn't break life is going to test you, not might. Not occasionally. Consistently, creatively, and sometimes relentlessly, it will challenge your plans, your patience, your self-belief, and your sense of what's fair. This isn't pessimism. This is preparation. Because the question was never whether difficulty would show up. The question is what you'll be made of when it does. And that, the quality of your response to adversity, is something you can build deliberately, systematically, before the storm arrives. Most people's psychological stability is a direct reflection of their external circumstances. When things are going well, they feel strong, capable, optimistic. When things fall apart, they fall apart with them. Their inner state is essentially hostage to outer events, and that makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to the inevitable turbulence of a real, ambitious life. But there's another way to operate. You can build what I'd call a mental fortress, an internal psychological foundation so solid that external events can shake the walls without bringing down the structure, not by becoming emotionally numb, not by pretending that difficult things don't matter, but by developing the genuine capacity to stay oriented, stay purposeful, and keep moving forward even when everything around you is uncertain. The cornerstone of that foundation is the principle of radical ownership. Most of the anxiety, frustration, and helplessness people experience comes from trying to control things that are genuinely outside their control. Other people's reactions, unexpected events, past mistakes, future uncertainties. They spend enormous mental energy on variables they cannot move. And that effort is not just wasted. It's actively depleting. It creates a chronic sense of powerlessness that erodes confidence and exhausts resilience over time. Psychologically resilient people are not less aware of those external variables. They're just strategically disciplined about where they direct their attention and energy. They focus on what they can influence: their thinking, their actions, their responses, their preparation. Everything else they observe without being consumed by it. This isn't passive acceptance. This is strategic focus, and it generates a sense of personal agency, the felt experience that your choices matter, that your actions have consequence, that you are not simply at the mercy of whatever happens to show up in your life. Building resilience also requires something that makes most people uncomfortable: voluntary exposure to stress. Not reckless exposure, not unnecessary suffering, but the deliberate practice of placing yourself in mildly challenging, uncomfortable situations so that your nervous system develops familiarity with pressure and learns, through repeated experience, that discomfort doesn't equal destruction. Cold exposure that requires staying composed when every cell in your body wants to escape. Public speaking that requires performing under social pressure. Difficult conversations that require staying grounded when emotions run high. Physically demanding training that requires pushing past the point where stopping feels reasonable. Every time you voluntarily engage with discomfort and navigate it successfully, you're building what researchers call resilience resources, a growing internal archive of evidence that you can handle hard things. That archive becomes your psychological reserve. When life presents something genuinely difficult, you don't face it as someone who has only ever been comfortable. You face it as someone who has trained. Recovery speed matters as much as initial response. Resilient people don't avoid failure. They don't experience fewer setbacks than everyone else. What distinguishes them is how quickly they return to functional orientation after a hit, and that recovery speed is trainable. It comes from developing what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to observe your own thinking rather than being entirely inside it. When something goes wrong and the emotional response floods in, you develop the capacity to step back slightly and notice the response without being swept away by it, not to suppress it, but to process it with enough distance that you can choose your next action deliberately rather than reactively. It also comes from purpose. When you have a clear sense of why your work matters to you, not in the abstract, but in a way that's deeply personal and specific, temporary setbacks become contextualized within a larger trajectory. The loss of one battle doesn't feel like the loss of the war because you remain oriented to what the war is actually about. Purpose doesn't make pain smaller. It makes it meaningful, and meaningful difficulty is navigable in a way that random, purposeless difficulty is not. One final piece: build your network before you need it. Resilience is not ultimately a solo sport. The people who consistently recover fastest from adversity almost always have relationships that provide honest perspective, practical support, and the simple but powerful experience of being genuinely seen and not alone. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. Build those relationships in the good times so they're there and solid when you need them. Your mental fortress doesn't make you invulnerable. Nothing does, and nothing should. It makes you sturdy enough to stay in the game, to keep building, keep growing, keep pursuing what matters, regardless of what circumstance shows up to test you. Build it now. The tests are coming, and you want to be ready. Chapter 10. The Focus Algorithm: Reclaiming Your Most Valuable Mental Resource. There's a resource you possess that is, in the current environment, becoming both increasingly scarce and increasingly powerful. It's not your time. It's not your network. It's not your skills, your credentials, or your connections. It's your ability to focus. Not the surface level, toggling between tabs version of attention that most people mistake for productivity. Deep, sustained, uninterrupted concentration, the kind that allows you to go below the surface of a problem, to produce work that reflects your actual capability, to make progress on the things that genuinely matter while everyone around you is scattered across 17 different inputs. That kind of focus is becoming rare, and rare things, in a competitive world, command enormous value. Here's what's actually happened to most people's attention. It's been systematically degraded, not through personal failure or lack of discipline, through deliberate, sophisticated engineering. The platforms and applications competing for your attention have been designed with extraordinary precision and investment to make switching feel rewarding and sustained focus feel uncomfortable. Every notification, every algorithmic content update, every infinite scroll has been calibrated to exploit the same dopamine pathways that make gambling addictive. Every time you give in to a distraction impulse, you're not just losing a few minutes of productive time. You're reinforcing the neural pathways of scattered attention. You're training your brain to expect and seek constant input variation. And over time, that training makes deep work feel genuinely difficult, not because it is inherently difficult, but because you've conditioned yourself out of it. The good news is that this is completely reversible. Focus is a trainable capacity. The same neuroplasticity that allowed distraction to degrade your concentration can rebuild it. And the process, once you understand it, is more straightforward than most people expect. Your brain actually operates through two distinct attention modes. The first is focused attention, directed, concentrated, specific. This is the mode that allows you to go deep on a single task, build complex understanding, and produce work that requires real mental engagement. The second is diffuse attention, open, associative, wide. This is the mode that allows your mind to wander productively, make unexpected connections, and generate the kind of creative insights that don't emerge from direct effort. Both modes are valuable. The problem is that most people spend almost all their time in an ineffective middle ground, neither truly focused nor truly diffuse, just perpetually half present across too many things simultaneously. High performers alternate between these modes deliberately. They work in concentrated blocks of genuine focus, then shift to intentional rest that allows diffuse processing to occur. This rhythm, intense focus, real recovery, intense focus, real recovery, is how extraordinary output gets produced sustainably. Building your focus capacity follows the same logic as building physical strength. You start with what you can genuinely sustain and progressively extend it. Begin with 5 minutes of absolute single-task focus. No tabs open that aren't relevant. Phone in a different room. Not face down on the desk, actually in a different room. 1. Task. 5 minutes. When 5 minutes becomes genuinely easy, extend to 10, then 15, then 30, then 90. 90 minutes of truly uninterrupted deep focus directed at your most important work will outproduce 4 hours of distracted, fragmented effort. This isn't an approximation. Research on knowledge work output consistently shows this. Quality of attention matters more than quantity of time, by a significant margin. Your environment is not neutral in this equation. Your workspace is either supporting your concentration or actively working against it. Every visual distraction, every auditory interruption, every easily accessible source of easier stimulation is competing with your capacity to go deep. Protecting your focus blocks means designing your environment deliberately, removing what competes, optimizing what supports. There's also a technique called time boxing that fundamentally changes your relationship with important work. Instead of working on something until it's finished, which your brain resists because completion feels distant and uncertain, you commit to working on something for a specific defined period. 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 90 minutes. The defined boundary makes starting easier because you're not committing to finishing. You're committing to showing up for a window, and within that window, you practice monotasking, the increasingly radical act of doing one thing at a time with your complete, undivided attention. Multitasking is a myth with a real cost. What you're actually doing when you multitask is rapidly switching between tasks, and every switch carries a cognitive cost. Attention residue, researchers call it. Part of your mental bandwidth remains stuck on the previous task even as you redirect your conscious focus to the next one. The result is that you're never fully present for anything, which means everything you produce operates below your actual capability. One thing, complete attention, defined time. That's the formula. The ultimate destination of this practice, the thing that makes all of this effort genuinely worth it, is what researchers describe as flow states. Periods of peak performance where you are so completely absorbed in your work that self-consciousness dissolves, time perception distorts, and you operate at a level of capability that surprises even you. Flow isn't mystical. It's a specific neurological state with known prerequisites, a clear goal, immediate feedback, and a challenge level, calibrated to be slightly above your current skill level. Create those conditions consistently, protect them with real discipline, and flow becomes a regular part of your professional and creative life, not an occasional accident. In a world drowning in distraction, your ability to focus deeply is not just a productivity tool. It's a form of freedom, the freedom to do your best work, to be fully present, to create something that actually reflects who you are and what you're capable of. That freedom is worth protecting. Chapter 11, The Momentum Protocol, How to Build Force That Carries You Forward. Here's something nobody tells you about momentum. It doesn't start with motivation. It doesn't start with confidence. It doesn't start with having a clear plan, the right resources, or the perfect moment. It starts with one thing and only one thing: action. Specifically, the smallest possible action you can take right now in the direction of where you want to go. Most people have momentum completely backwards. They believe that motivation creates action, that you need to feel driven, inspired, energized before you can legitimately begin. So they wait. They wait to feel ready. They wait for the resistance to lift. They wait for circumstances to align in a way that makes moving forward feel natural rather than forced. And they wait. And they wait. And nothing changes. Because here's the truth that most people never discover: motivation doesn't create action. Action creates motivation. Momentum doesn't precede movement. Movement creates momentum. The feeling of being driven and engaged and energized that you're waiting for before you start, that feeling is generated by starting, not the other way around. Your brain operates in two fundamental modes when it comes to tasks: initiation mode and continuation mode. When you're in continuation mode, when you're already moving, already engaged, already inside the work, the brain's natural tendency is to keep going. Objects in motion stay in motion. But when you're in initiation mode, sitting at the starting line, looking at everything between here and where you want to be, the brain's natural tendency is resistance. The challenge isn't maintaining momentum. The challenge is generating the initial activation energy required to shift from stopped to moving. And that activation energy needs to be as small as possible. This is non-negotiable. If the starting action feels too large, if it triggers the subconscious resistance mechanisms we've already discussed, you'll stay exactly where you are while feeling progressively worse about it. The goal is to make the entry point so small, so genuinely unthreatening, that your subconscious has no legitimate basis for resistance. If you want to write, your activation energy is opening the document, not writing a chapter, not finishing a draft. Opening the document and writing one sentence. One sentence your subconscious cannot argue with. If you want to build a business, your activation energy is spending 15 minutes on one specific, concrete next step. Not building the whole thing, one step. If you want to get physically stronger, your activation energy is putting on your training gear and stepping outside, not completing the full session, just getting dressed and stepping out. These micro commitments are not timid. They are strategically brilliant because they consistently outsmart the resistance that keeps most people permanently in starting mode. And here's what happens once you start. You almost always do more than you committed to, because once you're in motion, continuation becomes the path of least resistance. You said one sentence. You write 3 paragraphs. You said 15 minutes. You work for an hour. You said just step outside. You complete the whole session. The momentum builds from the inside out. But sustaining that momentum over time, building the kind of forward motion that compounds into genuinely extraordinary results, requires one more critical ingredient. You have to track your inputs, not your outcomes. This distinction is everything. Outcome tracking measures results. The scale number, the revenue figure, the audience size, the external validation. Outcome tracking feels logical and motivating at first, but it has a fatal flaw. Outcomes often lag significantly behind inputs. You can do everything right for weeks and still see minimal external change. When you're tracking outcomes and the numbers don't move, your brain interprets this as evidence that your efforts aren't working, and momentum collapses. Input tracking measures your actions. How many days you showed up, how many calls you made, how many pages you wrote, how many times you chose the aligned behavior over the comfortable one. Inputs are entirely within your control every single day. And when you track them, you can feel successful, genuinely, legitimately successful, regardless of whether the external outcomes have caught up yet. Because success, properly understood, is the consistent execution of the right actions. Results are what those actions eventually produce. Track the cause, not the effect. Celebrate every small win, not with fanfare that feels disproportionate, but with genuine internal acknowledgement. You did what you said you were going to do. That is not a small thing. In a world where most people consistently break promises to themselves, keeping even tiny commitments is meaningful data about who you're becoming. There's a point in the momentum-building process. It arrives at different times for different people, but it always arrives with consistent effort that researchers describe as escape velocity, the point where maintaining progress becomes easier than stopping it, where your new behaviors have become habitual enough that they feel more natural than not doing them, where your identity has shifted enough that acting consistently with your goals doesn't require discipline. It requires simply being yourself. Getting to escape velocity takes longer than most people want it to. The timeline is rarely inspiring, but the experience of operating from that place, of being someone who simply moves consistently toward what matters, is unlike anything available on the comfortable side of inertia. Build the smallest possible activation energy. Start before you feel ready. Track your inputs. Celebrate your process. Keep your promises to yourself. Do those things every day, and momentum will carry you further than motivation ever could. Chapter 12. Peak Performance on Demand. Operating at your highest level. Consistently. Here's a question worth sitting with. When was the last time you performed at what felt like your absolute best? Not a decent day, not solid execution, but that rare experience of operating at a level that felt fluid, focused, almost effortless, where your thinking was sharp, your energy was high, your work reflected your actual capability rather than a compromised version of it. Now, here's the follow-up question. Was that experience something you created or something that happened to you? For most people, peak performance is accidental. It shows up unexpectedly, stays for a while, and disappears without warning. They have no real understanding of what produced it or how to reliably reproduce it, which means they spend most of their time hoping for it and settling, on the majority of days, for considerably less. Elite performers operate from an entirely different framework. They understand that peak mental states are not random gifts. They are the predictable outputs of specific inputs, particular mental, physical, and environmental conditions that, when consistently created, reliably produce exceptional performance. And once you understand what those conditions are and how to engineer them, peak performance stops being an occasional accident and starts being a repeatable practice. Let's start with the foundational insight that most people never apply. Your brain is not equally capable throughout the day. You have natural cycles of cognitive capacity, periods of peak mental sharpness, periods of moderate function, and periods where your brain is actively in recovery mode. These cycles are biological, not personal. They're shaped by circadian rhythms, neurochemistry, and the basic metabolic requirements of sustained neural activity. Most people either don't know these cycles exist, or they know about them and promptly ignore them, scheduling their most cognitively demanding work during low energy windows and their easiest tasks during peak windows. This is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make with your mental capital. Mapping your personal energy patterns is straightforward, but requires honest observation. For 2 weeks, track your energy and cognitive sharpness at roughly 2-hour intervals throughout the day. Note when you feel naturally alert and capable. Note when your thinking feels slower, your motivation flatter, your decision-making more effortful. Patterns will emerge, and those patterns represent your cognitive schedule. Once you know your schedule, protect your peak windows with everything you have. These are the hours during which your brain is operating at its highest natural capacity, and they are your most valuable resource. Reserve them exclusively for your most important, most cognitively demanding work. Move everything that doesn't require your best thinking, administrative tasks, routine decisions, low-stakes communication, to your low-energy windows. This single adjustment, consistently applied, will change the quality and quantity of your output in ways that feel almost unfair. Beyond energy management, elite performance requires mastering what's called state management, the ability to deliberately shift your mental and physical state to match whatever a situation requires. This isn't theoretical. Your mental state is highly responsive to physical inputs. Specific breathing patterns can shift your nervous system from activated and anxious to calm and focused within minutes. 2 to 3 minutes of slow diaphragmatic breathing with an extended exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, your body's rest and digest mode, which reduces cortisol, clears cognitive fog, and creates the calm alertness that's ideal for complex thinking. Physical posture sends direct signals to your brain about your current state. Expansive, upright posture with open chest and relaxed shoulders consistently produces neurochemical shifts associated with confidence and capability, not as a performance, but as a genuine physiological response to body position. Strategic movement before important work, even 10 minutes of physical activity, increases blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, elevates norepinephrine and dopamine levels, and measurably improves focus, memory, and executive function. Your body and brain are not separate systems. What you do with one directly affects the capacity of the other. There's also the matter of cognitive load and managing it ruthlessly. Your brain has a finite processing budget for any given period. Every decision you make, every unresolved question you carry, every unnecessary complexity in your environment draws from that budget. When the budget runs low, performance degrades across the board. Thinking becomes slower. Creativity decreases. Impulse control weakens. Elite performers understand this and design their lives accordingly. They reduce the number of decisions they make about things that don't matter, so they preserve cognitive capacity for the decisions that do. They create systems and routines for recurring tasks, so those tasks run on autopilot rather than drawing from their thinking budget. They eliminate environmental noise and complexity from their high-performance periods, so nothing competes with their primary focus. This isn't obsessive rigidity. It's the strategic preservation of your most valuable mental resource. And finally, because it cannot be overstated, recovery is not optional. Peak performance is not a sustainable constant state. It's a cyclical capacity that requires genuine restoration between periods of high output. Quality sleep, not minimized, but genuinely prioritized, is the single most impactful recovery investment you can make. The research on sleep deprivation's effect on cognitive performance is unambiguous and sobering. There is no habit, supplement, or technique that compensates for consistently inadequate sleep. Beyond sleep, deliberate breaks, physical movement, time in natural environments, and activities that allow genuine mental disengagement are not luxuries. They are maintenance. They are what makes the next peak performance possible. You don't have to leave your best performances to chance anymore. You can engineer the conditions that produce them. You can learn your cycles, manage your states, protect your cognitive load, and honor your recovery. Do that consistently, and your best performance stops being your ceiling. It becomes your floor. Chapter 13. Rewriting the story you've been living in. You are not living your life. You are living your story about your life. And there's a meaningful difference between those two things. Your life is the raw, unfiltered sequence of events, relationships, challenges, and opportunities that have occurred and will occur. Your story is the interpretation you've built around those events, the meaning you've assigned to what happened, the conclusions you've drawn about yourself and what's possible for you, the narrative framework through which all new experiences get filtered. The story feels like reality. It feels objective. It feels like simply describing what is true. But it isn't. It's a construction, and like all constructions, it can be rebuilt. Here's where the story gets installed. Primarily in childhood and adolescence, when your interpretive capacity was still developing and you had no reliable filter for evaluating whether the narratives being handed to you were actually accurate. A parent's offhand comment about your capabilities. A teacher's assessment that quietly became your own. A formative failure that got translated by a young mind without the perspective to contextualize it properly into a permanent conclusion about your potential. Over time, those initial interpretations attracted evidence. Your reticular activating system, calibrated to your existing story, began selectively delivering confirmation. Every piece of evidence that supported the narrative got filed and reinforced. Every piece that contradicted got quietly filtered out, until the story felt not just true, but obviously true, undeniably true, just the way things are. But stories are not facts. They are interpretations. And interpretations can be changed without lying to yourself or pretending the difficult things didn't happen. The process begins with what I call narrative archaeology. You go looking for the events that became the foundation of your current story, the moments that generated the most consequential conclusions about yourself, the experiences that, consciously or not, shaped your beliefs about what you deserve, what you're capable of, and what's realistic for someone with your particular history. You look at those events not to relitigate them or to be consumed by them, but to examine the meanings you assign to them. Because the meaning was always a choice. Not a conscious choice, perhaps, but a choice nonetheless. And that means it can be remade. The rejection that became "I'm not good enough" could also be interpreted as "I was developing resilience before I had the language for it." The failure that became "I always come up short" could be reframed as "that experience taught me things that comfortable success never could have." The difficult circumstances that became "people like me don't get to have that kind of life" could be reconstructed as "I've navigated harder things than most people will ever face, which means I'm more equipped than I've been giving myself credit for." This is not toxic positivity. This is not pretending that difficult things were secretly good. It's recognizing that your past experiences are raw material, and that the structure you build from that material is not fixed. It's chosen. Your new story needs to meet one essential criterion to take root. It has to be genuinely believable to your subconscious, not aspirationally true, authentically plausible. If the gap between your current narrative and your new one is too dramatic, your subconscious will reject the new story as fabrication, and you'll feel worse for having tried. But if you can find legitimate reinterpretations of your actual experiences, angles that are genuinely honest, but more empowering than the ones you've been carrying, your subconscious can accept and eventually embrace them. Here's what makes the new story stick. You have to live it before it fully feels real. When you face a decision, you ask yourself what someone operating from your new story would do. When an opportunity arises, you respond from your new identity rather than your old pattern. When you encounter a challenge, you draw on your new narrative's framework. This is difficulty, which I navigate rather than the old ones. This is evidence that I was right to doubt myself. Every action taken from your new story provides evidence that supports it. Every moment you choose the new interpretation over the old one, you're depositing into the new narrative's credibility account. Over time, and this is the part worth staying patient for, the new story begins to feel more real than the old one, because it has more recent evidence behind it. The final and most powerful element of story reconstruction is what I call future self-orientation. You create a detailed, specific, emotionally engaged vision of who you'll be when you're fully living your new story, not a vague, better version of yourself, but a specific person with specific ways of thinking and responding, specific daily habits and relationships, a specific quality of presence and decision-making. That vision becomes your North Star. When you're unclear about how to respond to something, you ask, what would that person do? When you're tempted back into old patterns, you remember who you're in the process of becoming, and you choose behavior that moves you toward them rather than away. You are not stuck with the story you were handed. You never were. You were just never shown that you had the option to write a different one. You do, and the pen has always been in your hand. Chapter 14, The Mastery Mindset. Becoming someone who never stops growing. Every person who has ever built something genuinely remarkable, in any field, across any domain, at any point in history, shared one characteristic more reliably than any other. Not talent, not timing, not resources or connections or luck, though all of those played their roles. The one consistent distinguishing characteristic was this: they never stopped learning. They never arrived at a point where they believed they had nothing left to improve. They carried a genuine, sustained curiosity about their own development that didn't diminish with success. It deepened with it. Psychologist Carol Dweck's research gave us the language for this: growth mindset versus fixed mindset. But I want to take you past the surface of what those terms have come to mean in popular usage, because the real application is more specific and more powerful than most people realize. A fixed mindset isn't just pessimism or low self-esteem. It's a specific orientation toward ability, the belief, often deeply subconscious, that your qualities are essentially static. That talent is something you either have or you don't. That struggling with something is evidence of a permanent limitation rather than a temporary gap. That failure reveals something real and enduring about who you are. People operating from this orientation don't just avoid challenges because they're lazy or fearful. They avoid challenges because, within their framework, failure carries an unacceptably high cost. If your worth and capability are fixed and finite, then a visible failure isn't just a setback, it's a revelation. It tells you, and the world, something permanent about your limits. So you protect yourself. You stay within the boundaries of what you're already good at. You frame your avoidance as discernment. You curate an identity around existing strengths rather than building new ones. And you stop growing. A growth mindset reframes the entire equation. When you genuinely believe that your abilities are developable, that intelligence, skill, confidence, creativity, resilience are all things you can build through dedicated effort and strategic learning, failure loses its identity-threatening power. It becomes information, data about what needs to be refined, practiced, understood more deeply. The question shifts from, am I capable of this, to, what do I need to learn to become capable of this? That single shift changes what you're willing to attempt, how you respond when things are difficult, and ultimately, what you're able to build over the course of a lifetime. But developing a true mastery mindset requires going beyond adopting a belief. It requires restructuring your relationship with the process of learning, specifically with the uncomfortable parts of that process. There's a practice called deliberate practice, and it's meaningfully different from regular practice or simple repetition. Deliberate practice means working specifically and intentionally on your weakest areas. It means operating at the outer edge of your current capability, where mistakes are frequent and progress feels slow. It means seeking honest, direct feedback and using it to adjust rather than defend. Most people avoid deliberate practice because it requires sustained engagement with what you're not yet good at. It's uncomfortable in a specific, sustained way. It requires the ego to accept a temporary but very real experience of inadequacy. But deliberate practice is where mastery actually lives, not in the repetition of what you've already mastered. That's maintenance. In the disciplined engagement with what you haven't mastered yet, that's development. Reframe failure as the primary mechanism of learning, not the unfortunate cost of attempting. The most accomplished people in every field have failed more than average performers, not despite their success, but as a direct function of it. They've attempted more, which means they've failed more, which means they've extracted more learning, which means they've developed faster. Their willingness to fail frequently and visibly is not separate from their eventual mastery. It is the pathway to it. This reframe is not easy. It requires you to be genuinely okay with being bad at things in front of other people for extended periods, in pursuit of something that might not pay off on your preferred timeline. That's legitimately hard. But every moment of that discomfort is building something. Neural pathways, refined technique, hard-earned insight. That comfortable competence never could. Maintain what the Zen tradition calls beginner's mind, the capacity to approach even familiar domains with genuine curiosity, as though encountering them fresh. The moment you believe you've fully mastered something, you've installed a ceiling. The moment you approach it with genuine openness to discovering something you haven't yet understood, the ceiling disappears. The most masterful performers in any field are almost always the most curious about it, not despite their expertise, because of it. Advanced understanding reveals new layers of complexity that are invisible to beginners. The more you know, the more clearly you can see how much more there is to know. And underlying all of this, the foundation that makes sustained mastery development possible over years and decades, is intrinsic motivation, the genuine personal satisfaction of getting better at something for its own sake, not for the external recognition, not for the validation, not even primarily for the outcomes, for the profound, uniquely human experience of developing yourself deliberately and watching what becomes possible as a result. Build that relationship with your own growth. Protect it. Feed it. It will take you further than any single talent or fortunate circumstance ever could. Chapter 15. The Unstoppable Identity. Becoming the person who never quits on themselves. We've covered a great deal of ground together. We've talked about how your subconscious programming was installed and how to update it. We've explored the architecture of confidence, the mechanics of identity change, the neuroscience of fear, the systems behind sustainable momentum, and the conditions for peak performance. But all of it, every concept, every technique, every reframe we've discussed, is pointing toward one single destination. Not a goal, not an achievement, not an outcome. A person, specifically the person you are in the process of becoming. Because ultimately, the quality of your life, the depth of your relationships, the significance of your work, the resilience of your spirit when things get hard, is not determined by what you achieve. It's determined by who you are. And who you are is always a work in progress, always being shaped by the choices you're making today, in this moment, and in every moment going forward. Most people drift through this process. They don't consciously choose who they're becoming. They let the current take them. Circumstances, other people's expectations, the accumulated momentum of unexamined habits. And they wonder eventually how they ended up so far from where they actually wanted to be. You are doing something different. You have been doing something different, chapter by chapter, page by page, throughout this entire experience. You've been building understanding that most people never build. And that understanding is the foundation of everything we're about to talk about. The identity I want you to step into, the one you've been moving toward throughout all of this, is what I call the unstoppable identity. And I want to be precise about what that means. It doesn't mean you never doubt. Doubt is part of being human and part of honest self-assessment. It doesn't mean you never struggle. Struggle is where growth happens. It doesn't mean you never fail. Failure is how you learn everything worth knowing. What it means is this: you never quit on yourself. You never reach a point where you decide that the version of you standing here today is the final version. You never accept a limitation as permanent without having genuinely tested whether it's real. You never let the opinions of people who aren't living your life define what's possible for your life. And you never, under any circumstances, stop. The unstoppable identity is built on 4 core beliefs, not as intellectual concepts you agree with, but as operating principles so deeply embedded in your subconscious that they activate automatically when you need them most. The first, you are capable of learning whatever you need to learn. Not immediately, not easily, but given genuine effort and time, there is no skill, no capability, no area of development that is permanently inaccessible to you. This belief doesn't remove the difficulty of growth. It removes the false ceiling you've been placing above it. The second, failure is always temporary and instructive. It is never a verdict on your permanent worth or potential. Every person you admire, every person who has built something real and meaningful, has a private history of significant failure. The failures didn't disqualify them. In many cases, the failures built them. The third, consistency matters more than talent. The person who shows up every day, who keeps their commitments to themselves through boredom and doubt and slow periods and external pressure, will outperform the person with twice the natural ability and half the consistency every single time over any meaningful time frame. This belief liberates you from the comparison trap. You don't need to be the most gifted. You need to be the most committed. The fourth, you are responsible for your response to everything that happens, not responsible for everything that happens to you. Life is not that fair or that simple, but completely, fully responsible for your response. And since your responses ultimately shape your outcomes more reliably than your circumstances do, this belief puts the steering wheel back in your hands regardless of what road you're on. These 4 beliefs, lived through consistent daily action, create an identity that becomes genuinely self-reinforcing over time. Here's how you build it from where you stand today. You start with what I call identity-confirming actions, small, daily behaviors that cast votes for the person you're becoming. Not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations. Just quiet, consistent choices made in the direction of who you've decided to be. You follow through on one commitment to yourself today that you would have previously let slide. You respond to one challenge with curiosity rather than defensiveness. You take one action toward a goal you've been hesitating on. You get back up from one setback instead of using it as justification to stop. Each of these actions individually is small. Collectively, over time, they are the most powerful force available to you because they are literally building, neuron by neuron, pathway by pathway, proof point by proof point, the architecture of someone who doesn't quit. There will be moments when your old identity feels more comfortable than your new one, when the familiar patterns of hesitation and self-doubt and settling feel safer than the unfamiliar territory of showing up fully, of asking more of yourself, of refusing to accept the current version of your situation as permanent. In those moments, you don't need to feel unstoppable. You just need to act like someone who is. Because your brain doesn't require feeling to rewire. It requires action. And the feelings follow, sometimes immediately, sometimes gradually, but always eventually. The consistent behavior of the person you're choosing to become. Here is what I want you to take from everything we've covered together. Your past does not determine your future. Your current circumstances do not define your potential. The limiting beliefs you've been carrying are not facts about who you are. They're programs that were installed without your conscious consent, and they can be updated. The techniques exist. The science is solid. The pathway is clear. What you do with what you now know is entirely up to you. Because information without application is just content. Knowledge without consistent action is just potential that never gets realized. And potential that never gets realized is, let's be honest, the most quietly heartbreaking thing there is. You are not here to stay the same. You are not here to protect the current version of yourself from discomfort. You are not here to wait for permission, perfect conditions, or complete certainty before you start becoming who you're actually capable of being. You are here to grow, to stretch, to build something, a life, a body of work, a version of yourself that reflects what you're genuinely made of. That process starts exactly where you are, with exactly what you have. And it starts now, not when you feel ready. Now. The most important question isn't whether you can reprogram your brain and become unstoppable. The science has answered that. You can. The only question that remains, the one only you can answer through the choices you make from this moment forward, is simply this: will you